everybody. Welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I have with me on the show today Dr. Sarah Kirchberger from the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University in the Department for Asia-Pacific Strategy and Security. Sarah is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne, for having me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
So Sarah is an expert on China, and we have often collaborated with her with the Marshall Center through various projects and initiatives. And that's what we will be discussing primarily today. More specifically, the overall threat of China, specifically to Europe, and the military ambitions of China, and how that has shifted after the Crimean invasion in 2014, annexation of Crimea, and also some policy recommendations for the transatlantic relationship and community to approach China. So why don't we begin by assessing the threat? So it's been said, by others, but also by yourself in your various publications, that China is employing a divide and conquer strategy in Europe and possibly further out into the world. So could you please describe and elaborate exactly what that entails for Europe more specifically?
Yes, sure. So I think it's pretty safe to say that China is actively and consciously deploying such a conquer and divide strategy. And you can see it most clearly in Europe in terms of how they utilize particular individual countries, such as Hungary, with which they have forged very intense and very close relationships to make it impossible, for instance, to the EU to come to a united decision, because the EU has the principle of having to have an anonymous vote. And if you want to, for instance, have a declaration condemning some sort of Chinese human rights abuses or something like that on an EU level, you need every single country to be on board with it. So it's theoretically enough and practically enough to have just one country not agreeing to that. And this is what China has done in the past. It has been able to inhibit such censoring mechanisms. And it has also used incentives to make it more difficult within Europe to arrive at other decisions that are not in China's interests. And you can see it also in a different way. You can see it in a way that China singles out other countries that it has more difficult relations with, such as Sweden, for instance, punishing them, like putting a lot of pressure on individual countries. Usually it's the smaller countries that suffer from this, and then trying to make an example of these countries. And the idea is not just to influence that one country and maybe to bully the country into adopting a different behavior. The idea seems to be to scare other countries that are of similar size and a similar position into imitating what that country has done to offend China. So in the case of Sweden that we're seeing right now, Sweden has been very critical of some Chinese policies, for instance, detaining foreign nationals in China, ignoring their Swedish citizenship in the case of this one bookseller that is still detained in China, who is a Swedish citizen, and has also criticized China on different grounds. And this is something that China tries to stop in other countries from happening. And so it tries to adopt a lot of measures against such countries. And this is something that we can see in the EU and also in Europe as a whole, outside of the EU, in terms of forming, for instance, a 17+1 as a separate mechanism, you could say, of engaging with Europe, but including post-communist countries that have not been part of the EU yet. So forging sort of a bridge into Europe by dividing the EU into countries that are part of the 17+1 and countries that are not. So there's a number really of different measures that China uses. And all of these together are quite effective, or have been quite effective in the past.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming that they're much better able to employ this strategy now that they have more leverage over these countries due to their increasing economic impact in Europe and in the world. And so, internationally, their economic might is growing, but so is their military. And you've written quite a bit about their military more specifically. And they, have collaborated and cooperated with Russia and Ukraine in the past in the arms industries in their industrial complex of Ukraine and Russia. So since the war in Crimea, Russia and Ukraine have grown further apart from each other in the military domain, but both have grown closer to China. So how does this affect China's political and military strategy? Would you say that Russian arms sales to China affect China's strategy? Is it that important of a relationship? And or do we have a wrong or a false impression when we think that China is in a much stronger relative position vis-a-vis Russia in strategic and economic terms?
That's an interesting question, and it's really also very complex. I think what we need to understand is that this relationship has really massively changed in 2014 due to the Crimea annexation that Russia did. And the result is that Russia has found itself in a situation where there were sanctions posed, of course, against Russia by the Western countries. And the situation has changed so much for Russia that it is now a strategic imperative of Russia's government to align itself closer to China. So in the past, it has been deemed very risky for Russian military industries to share their top level arms technologies with Chinese counterparts, because there have been many instances where China has not honored its commitments, has conducted reverse engineering, where the relationship was really difficult. And so arms industrial representatives are very critical of China as an arms customer. But after 2014, it seems that on a high level, on a high political level, the Russian government has decided that the strategic interest of alignment with China is an overriding interest. And so the arms industries have really been sort of ordered to be more cooperative. So in the past, Russia was very strict, only transferring like second grade or third rate technologies to China. And this has changed. So Russia is now open to transferring actually its top tier technologies to China. And China and Russia have in recent years even begun to jointly develop arms technologies. This is a new development. So this indicates a level of trust, you could say, a level of engagement and trust that hasn't been there before. And many people are wondering, as you said, Russia is somehow economically so inferior to China in terms of its economic strength, also in terms of its population size. So how could this relationship really be a long-term project? But I think when you argue like that, there's one thing missing in the equation, and that is Russia's vastly superior capability when it comes to nuclear deterrence. So Russia is really, in military terms, if you look at the nuclear part of the equation, is a superpower, is vastly superior to China. And this is an interesting bargaining chip that Russia can bring to the table. It's interesting to China to be a partner of such a power. It's also another factor. Russia is, after all, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has a veto right there. So aligning with Russia also has political incentives to bolster it, because these two powers together, they can really make sure that at the UN level, nothing can be done against their combined interests. And I think it's a combination of all these factors, the influence and also the size of Russia. Russia is the predominant Eurasian power due to its size alone. And if Russia and China together can come to an agreement that really gives each of these countries more or less a free hand in their own sphere of influence, that is really a formidable force that is aligning there. So the arms industrial relationship is just one part of that relationship taken as a whole. But I think it is an important part. It bolsters strategic cooperation. It creates trust over the long term, because these projects are very long term and very high level and very secret. So if you make repeated experiences of successfully conducting these types of projects over the long term, that also bolsters and creates trust that wasn't there in the beginning. So there are some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the potential relationship that could develop between those two. And I think there's a lot of debate in the West about whether we're approaching Russia in the right way, whether we're, encouraging Russia to go closer to the arms of China, if there's anything that we could do that would, at the same time, temper its aggressive and assertive behavior, and also be able to cooperate with Russia so that it wouldn't go too far to the east. It's very tricky there. But to continue on the question about Ukraine, Russia, China relationship. So Ukraine has also moved a little bit closer to China. But at the same time, we see that the West is also embracing Ukraine and supporting Ukraine and helping Ukraine in its current situation with Russia, especially also in the military domain, offering funds and financing to support Ukraine. So in this sense, we maybe expect Ukraine to eventually go even further westwards, perhaps join NATO if things get better in Ukraine. And that will certainly affect the relationship between Ukraine and China. So perhaps, the military technology that now China has access to from Ukraine will no longer be available, or just issues of this sense. So could you help us understand a little bit how that would affect China's military ambitions if Ukraine does end up moving further westward? Would it really be detrimental, or it's not that significant for China?
Yeah, that's a good question. My best guess is that most of the transfers that China's military has benefited from Ukraine are already in the past. I think the most prominent example, of course, is the aircraft carrier Liaoning, which was transferred as a unfinished hull from Ukraine to China. So that was the most visible symbol of that arms transfer that has been happening before 2014. And Ukraine has also supplied to China many different other technologies that were also very decisive, certain radar technologies, for instance. And I think most of these transfers that China vastly benefited from, really, at a time when Russia was not willing to export its top level technologies to China. Most of these transfers have already happened. So whatever happens now doesn't undo the effect that these transfers have had. But when it comes to now, what we're seeing is, of course, Ukraine has an interest to gather international support wherever Ukraine can find it. So turning to China in a way for support, for political support, but also for investments, for instance, is a logical choice at a time where Ukraine is not a member of NATO and still very much under threat from Russia. So in a way, China has been able to benefit from this conflict between Russia and Ukraine by becoming more attractive as a partner to both of them at the same time, and reaping the benefits of two worlds. So that is basically what has been happening. And what we've been seeing, I think, as far as I know, there has been sort of a brain drain. And this is an intangible element of arms transfers, is the human knowledge. It's not just, certain weapon systems that get transferred. Even more importantly, it's important to have access to the people who designed these systems, who are able to improve them, who are also maybe able to teach you how to organize the training better and so on. So what has been happening, as far as we know, is that there's been a huge and steady flow of expertise, in particular from Ukraine, but also from Russia to China. So there was an interesting news report in the Asia Times a couple of years ago that the lead designer, the Ukrainian lead designer of the aircraft carrier Varyak that was then transferred later to China, and also a chief designer of many other important shipbuilding projects in the Soviet Union, is now working in China as an expert. So they have founded apparently an institute in Qingdao, in particular for research into aircraft carrying platforms. And this guy with this huge amount of expertise under his belt seems to be hired there as an expert. And there have been apparently reports of dozens, if not hundreds, of similar cases where experts have found well-paid jobs in the Chinese arms industries. And at a time when at home, the arms industries are under pressure and not able to offer competitive, salaries. And this is definitely, I think, a problem that for Ukraine, maybe in the short term, Ukraine could benefit from transferring more knowledge and more technology to China. But in the long run, it's more a risk of sort of bleeding out, of losing a significant portion of its know-how. And there have in the past months actually been attempts by the United States to block a proposed Chinese investment in the famous Ukrainian company Motor-Sich, which is an aerospace engine company. And this would have been, if China would have been able to invest in that company and basically transfer the knowledge to China, this would really have been a massive game changer in terms of filling a capability gap in the Chinese ability to produce these engines for helicopters, for instance. But the United States has used its influence in Ukraine, its political pressure to convince the Ukrainian government not to allow this investment to happen. And China is now suing that decision. So we see, yes, a very, concerted effort on the part of China trying to invest into Ukrainian companies that it deems of strategic, importance to its own arms industries, and also to lure people into, contributing to the Chinese military buildup in a personal capacity.
Those are quite the strategies, and certainly it's benefiting from a lot of the geopolitical situations in the world, as you mentioned. But you also mentioned that China was going to take a leading role in areas such as quantum computing and artificial intelligence. So, I'm just curious, is it due to these types of strategies that they can actually start taking the lead? Because, the US, prior to that was the technological innovator, and now in this world where we're entering the so-called fourth industrial revolution, where everything is going to change and is rapidly changing before our eyes in terms of the technology we use, and 5G will certainly affect the way we operate militarily. So if China is poised to be the leader in these areas, that is extremely significant for the geopolitical competition that we're facing right now between the US and China. So is the US going to fall behind in this area? And is China actually taking a significant lead in this area?
Well, it's a lot of areas, and I think one must look at them at a case-by-case basis. It's not uniform, but there is definitely a risk that China could be, as they call it, leapfrog over a couple of development stages that other countries have gone through. So the idea in China has always been to try and acquire foreign technology in any way possible, any covert way, any legal way, utilizing all kinds of strategies, from academic exchanges to investments and mergers and acquisitions, to outright espionage. So the whole spectrum of possibilities that exist are all employed simultaneously, as well as, of course, luring talent to China, offering excellent research conditions and funding to top researchers around the world. So all these strategies are employed at the same time. And in some areas, you can definitely see that it has paid off. So what China has been doing, they have been watching very closely the innovation hubs of the world. For instance, Silicon Valley in the United States, or other, other areas, Cambridge, UK, where a lot of startups are located that try to come up with new ideas in the technological area. So in these areas, China has been trying to get a foothold in by financing projects. So it's the simple way is basically to be on the scene as a financer of interesting startups. And if you have the financial resources to maybe invest in 10 startups and only one ends up paying out something or being a good investment, and if it doesn't matter if it's a strategic interest, a commercial investor must always try to get a good return for its investment. But a state investor like China, operating through companies that look like they're private or look like they're actual commercial investors, but in reality are beholden to the Chinese state. And in those cases, the commercial part of the equation isn't all that important. And that's what China has been doing. And then there are other factors. For instance, in China, particular technologies can benefit and flourish from the fact that China has laxer regulation, for instance, of privacy and data privacy, or other ethical concerns. So for instance, in artificial intelligence, what happens is that you program an algorithm, and then you need for this algorithm to train itself and become better and better and better at doing whatever it is designed to do. You need a vast amount of raw data that your algorithm can use to train itself on, for instance, in facial recognition. So if you want an algorithm that is able to in record time identify a single individual out of 100 blurry faces on a photograph, then you need a vast database of faces, all types of faces, to train that algorithm on. And China, through its surveillance state measures that it has taken within the country to control the population, installing security cameras basically everywhere, taking pictures of everyone, has amassed a vast amount of such, for instance, facial recognition data. And of course, this is just one example. There's many other types of data. And other countries, like the European countries, have strict regulations against data collection and data storage that make it really harder for the AI industries here to have the same sort of success in the same amount of time. And biotechnology would be a different field where you have a similar effect, because ethical concerns in Western countries, for instance, against experiments with embryonic tissue and so on, are of course a problem insofar as certain experiments can't be conducted. Whereas in China, there are in many cases no such restrictions, which means that researchers who want to do particular things that have an ethical problem in the view of the Western world sometimes find it attractive to move their research to China. So this is the type of incentive also that China can use to its advantage.
Yes, I mean, one can almost say that due to its more flexible ethics, it's better positioned for the future, which is kind of scary to think about.
It is indeed scary. So we do not yet know where that will lead. For instance, in terms of AI, AI can be used for a lot of beneficial things, without a doubt. For instance, in medical applications, we already know that AI is already better at detecting cancerous tumors on X-rays than any trained radiologist could be. So there's many beneficial applications, but of course there's also potential military applications of AI that are not benign at all. and pose a lot of difficult ethical questions. And if you have an actor like China that is not known for voluntarily restricting its own activities due to ethical concerns, let's put it that way, it's difficult to envisage a regime that could regulate such problems nationwide, worldwide, with support of China, with actual support of China, not just nominal support, but with actual compliance by China. It's hard to envision that.
Yes, definitely. But interestingly enough, we're speaking about the military and technology and AI, but you mentioned that surprisingly, this is not China's clear priority, and that the growth rate of other budgetary items such as education or social security has actually far outpaced the defense budget. That I found that to be very interesting because it seems to have a long-term strategy to enhance or to bolster its societal abilities and capabilities. It's investing in its population, and that's really what progressives in the United States always try to push for. So how do you think this will affect the geostrategic competition?
I should perhaps qualify the statement that you just quoted. I wrote that, I think, 2 or 3 years ago in a chapter on China's defense industries. And what is meant by that is that the budgetary percentage of defense spending that goes into defense as a percentage of state spending has not grown as fast as other percentages within the same time frame have. But they have still grown, it has still grown. So this means there are other priorities, apparently, if you go by spending, that are valued as equally important or perhaps even more important during that time frame as military spending. But that doesn't mean that military spending is insignificant or that it's not a priority. It's just not maybe the top or the only priority during that time frame. I think when we look at the tangents that we've been seeing now this past year and the past 2 years maybe, how tangents have been rising and how China has been acting much more aggressively, for instance, in the Taiwan Strait and also in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, maybe we will see that this trend is going to change and that military spending is potentially, I expect, becoming a larger share again of the budget compared with other priorities. But in general, of course, it's right. China is investing in a lot of different things besides the military. And this is probably related to a concept that is very popular in China. It's called a comprehensive national power. It is a concept, the idea is that national power is something that consists of many different things that contribute to it. It's not just military power, it's economic power. It's also, you could say, maybe demographic stability could also be contributing to it. Social security could be contributing to it. And in China, a lot of think tanks have actually developed indices based on this concept of comprehensive national power, measuring all the countries of the world against each other. And the idea is, of course, to map the progress that China has been making, moving up the ranks, especially compared to the United States. So looking at the great powers of the world and how their comprehensive national power is composed and how it has developed, and mapping that in comparison to China, and then trying to patch the problems that China still has and trying to bolster the power of China, addressing all these issues that could potentially be weaknesses for China in the future, such as the demographic development, which is a big concern for China, definitely, or pollution is another huge concern for China because, of course, it endangers the basis of also the economic development. If you have degrading quality of air, degrading quality of arable land, and so on, that's of course a problem. So addressing all these things that are endanger China's continued rise is probably the overarching priority. But at the same time, the military development, I think right now, is a very, very important concern. It has many functions. Some are symbolic to show to the world and to show to the Chinese population that China is now a first-tier power and cannot be, bullied, whatever that means in their understanding. But also it has actual military functions. The idea is to deter outsiders from meddling, as China would probably call it, in affairs that China considers to be internal affairs, that others might think are not exactly internal Chinese affairs, but international affairs. But the idea is to make this more and more unattractive, more and more difficult for outside powers to even try and influence the situation, due to creating a situation where Chinese forces are so vastly superior to everything that is in the region, to make this a non-starter from the beginning. I think that is the philosophy behind it.
And so, I mean, that just leads me to ask, the ultimate debate that we're having as scholars when it comes to measuring the threat of China, about how dangerous it actually is to allow China to rise. So, many are in the camp that China is basically trying to export its value system and to influence the world internationally, while others are in another camp saying that no, it's actually just more interested in its internal affairs and its sphere of influence, and just keeping the West out of its political issues. So which one of the camps, or maybe a third camp, do you belong in?
Well, I belong in the camp that thinks that much of what we're seeing, if not all, is basically driven by the survival instincts and survival interests of the Chinese Communist Party. I think this is a party that is very paranoid, that is constantly under threat in its own imagination of being overthrown. And this party is basically trying to make the world secure for its own rule, for its continued rule. So I think this is the logic. And China's national interest is perhaps not exactly the same as the survival interest of the Communist Party, even though the Communist Party goes to great lengths to try and suggest exactly that. So the Communist Party tries to suggest that its own survival interests are exactly the same as the national interest of the Chinese nation. And I think that is a statement that can definitely be contested and should be contested. So if you look at it that way, I think due to the nature of this party and due to its worldview, where it always defines itself in opposition to hostile Western forces, there isn't really a situation where it would ever feel secure. So even if the Chinese Communist Party would at some point be successful in dominating its sphere of influence completely, including having, integrated, as they call it, Taiwan into it, for instance, and dominating the South China Sea, even in such a situation, I do not think that this party would ever be, sufficiently secure. So we would then see probably an extension of this influence further and further abroad, even though for the time being they might be content within the own region. I think ultimately the idea would be to fight against those systems that put an inherent danger, that by their own nature, by their democratic nature, for instance, pose a risk for the survival of the Communist Party. And I think one of the indicators that shows us clearly where the priorities lie is that actually the spending for internal surveillance measures in China has, I think, since 2011 actually been higher than the defense spending. So the internal surveillance and internal suppression of dissent seems to be an even higher priority than the military. And this is quite telling, I think. So in that sense, whether we like it or not, our democratic polities we stand in opposition to this type of regime just by virtue of the nature of our different political systems. This does not mean that there needs to be war between us, but it is a reality that there's a conflict of interest, a security dilemma, or whatever you want to call it, that is not easily bridged. And so I'm not sure in what camp I am exactly, but I definitely think that the idea that China can be domesticated or tamed easily into becoming the kind of a responsible stakeholder of the existing international system, as everyone hoped would be possible, isn't so easy if one neglects the reality of this inner Chinese perception that the Communist Party is basically always in opposition, always under threat from Western subversion. So yeah, that's the situation, I think. And what we can do is be realistic about it. We need to be clear what the priorities are that the other side has and follows, and we need to be clear what our own core interests are, to use a Chinese phrase. One core interest that we should have, hopefully, is, for instance, to make sure that nobody interferes with our democratic processes, that nobody poisons the public discourse in our countries, and that our citizens are secure when they travel abroad, and so on. So this is some of the priorities that we should have. And we will find that in some cases they clash with China's core interests, and we will need to be firm, and we will need to find ways of exerting our own influence to make sure that we will not be pushed further and further against the wall.
Yes, I mean, thanks for explaining that so meticulously. It's true, it's not necessarily one camp or the other, but really just laying out the issues that we're facing. There is a conflict of values and a conflict of interest. So no matter what particular issue or agreement or political or economic or military issue you're facing, you're always going to have to include that very important detail and fact. And so that brings me to move this conversation more towards policy recommendations. So, you've recently worked on a project with the Atlantic Council on a transatlantic policy towards China. And this has been very difficult to achieve in the last few years. We seem to have a different level of threat perception, perhaps, in the EU and in the United States. Towards China. Perhaps recently the EU has changed its rhetoric towards China, whereas the United States has been very firm in its approach, saying that this is an era of great power competition. China is our strategic competitor, and policy moves have followed that rhetoric. So how can the Atlantic community be better prepared to face China together as a whole?
Absolutely right, Suzanne. It's exactly what we found. We've worked on this project, as you say, over the course of the past year. So almost an entire year, a great team of colleagues. Hans Bindendijk is one of them, and Didi Tatlow is another one, and Frank Kramer and several others have contributed to it. And we've been meeting and debating and studying the empirical side of things to try and come up with good recommendations. And it became very clear that the picture is extremely complicated, depending on what issue area you're looking at. So we have identified a couple of areas where we say there's high convergence of perceptions between the United States and the European actors, but there's also areas where there's maybe mixed convergence, medium convergence, and areas where there's a low convergence, asymmetrical views of the situation. And let me just maybe very briefly go through what they are, and then I can come up with a couple of recommendations that we worked out. So the high convergence, where we find almost no difference of opinion regarding China, is the human rights and coercive diplomacy area. So there, everyone agrees basically in the transatlantic sphere that Chinese malign actions, human rights violations, and also coercive diplomacy, trying to do this divide and conquer strategy, for instance, these things are not good, are dangerous, and need to be curbed. So there's no big debate there. And then we have an area of economic and investment and technology cooperation with China. And there is some asymmetry there because the United States has a much more acute sense of how much Chinese, for instance, intellectual property theft in the past has fueled China's military buildup. So China has really used investments and all these economic techniques, mergers and acquisitions and so on, to extract technological knowledge from all the Western countries, basically to convert them ultimately also into military technologies that directly endanger the safety of the United States in the Western Pacific. So that is a sense of threat that is definitely very low, I think, in Europe across the board. So most people see intellectual property theft as an economic problem, a danger to our industrial base. But the idea that we are fueling a military buildup and that this could really end up in a conflict has not really been there in Europe. So I think this is part of the reason why it was so difficult for the United States government to get support from Europe for some of these initiatives curbing Chinese tech imports, for instance. So Europeans have usually interpreted that as an attempt of the US to retain its tech supremacy for economic reasons, not so much for military security reasons. So there's an asymmetry of perceptions there. And then in the third area, that's the military security area, there's a huge asymmetry because the United States is, of course, much more aware of the military risk to its own situation in the Western Pacific. And the United States is a provider of security to several allies in that region that are under threat and that have territorial disputes with China, such as Japan, for instance, or the Philippines. So the United States is acutely aware of this security risk and the danger of escalation, what happens if deterrence fails in Taiwan, for instance. Whereas in Europe, there was a perception until very recently that the risk of war is actually low, that it's not in China's interest to enter into any sort of conflict, that's probably only a very theoretical prospect, and that definitely China would not be a security risk to Europe, because of course it's so far away. So what has been happening recently is in Europe that people have become aware that there are maybe indirect risks from a military confrontation that Europe would still suffer from, that there could be a risk that NATO could become involved through Article 5, or that our critical infrastructures that we are building up in Europe, in some cases with the help of China, might become bargaining chips in the case of tensions or in the case of a conflict, or could even be targeted in some way to be disabled, to inhibit logistic support for the United States or whatnot. So there has been a conversation in the recent months, I would say, and maybe reaching back to 2019, started, I think, partly by NATO as an organization, of taking the security risks more seriously within Europe. And ultimately, it is in Europe's interest that deterrence does not fail, that the situation does not escalate. But Europeans have, in many cases, failed to appreciate how serious the problem has really become. And this is basically, in a nutshell, the most important, part of our analysis, that there is this divergence of perception based on where each country is situated and how each country's relations with China is. And what we came up with in terms of recommendations is we think there needs to be a more unified picture, a more unified situational awareness among all the transatlantic partners regarding the challenges, in plural, that China poses. So we need to overcome these asymmetries in perception that are in many cases a result of incomplete information. So information sharing is one of the key recommendations that we have come up with, that we say there needs to be an institutional mechanism, a council, you could say, that does nothing other than really collect all this information coming out of the different countries and feed it back, and that starts a consultation process so that the transatlantic partners are all in the picture, all in the same boat when it comes to how changes in the situation with China in one area affects all the other areas and how it affects all of the partners. So this is really the basis, to have a shared awareness. And based on that, one can then think of concrete initiatives to address particular concerns. And maybe in some cases, you will not be able to get everyone on board. Some concerns are maybe not shared by everyone. But then it's possible to think of little coalitions forming around a particular issue, and these countries starting to address it. And maybe if they're successful, others will then join. So we think this is a more realistic approach, rather than trying to have everyone on board on every single issue, which is probably never going to happen. It's probably more realistic to pick the issues of the strongest concern that are the most urgent to address, try to get everyone on board that shares this threat perception, and start to address it in a practical way. And by that mechanism, start to create momentum for these types of initiatives. So that is basically what we're trying to recommend.
Well, that was definitely a very good place to start, and some great recommendations there. I hope that both sides of the Atlantic agree with your report and to get together and start their future policies. But what's very important between the EU and the United States, there's always been issues between them on trade. And this, you mentioned also, is particularly difficult in the areas of economic, trade, investment, debt, and intellectual property rights between the EU and the US to achieve convergence towards China. And we've also heard often about a US-EU trade deal. Some are into it, some are not. Do you think that that would actually help, this basically objective that you have with the Atlantic Council and with the community of scholars as a whole that are trying to find ways for the transatlantic community to approach China in a stronger, more united front? Would that be something that would benefit our stance in this area of particularly difficult convergence towards China?
Well, definitely. Any sort of transatlantic agreements on anything would basically be beneficial. So if we have a free trade agreement and we have all kinds of other agreements regulating how we do business with each other, then that is always a strong starting point from which to jointly address China.
Yes.
And face China, because divide and conquer also applies to international trade agreements, of course. So when the Trump administration did the phase one trade deal without consulting with its European partners, that was, of course, also, I think, perceived a little bit as a snub in Europe. And then on the other hand, when the EU, at very short notice, after 7 years of negotiations, one must grant that, at the end of the last year, in principle, agreed to CAI, the investment agreement with China. That was also perceived as a snub in the United States, and rightly so. It was like 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the inauguration of the new US administration. And of course, it would have been a strong signal of transatlantic unity to consult with the incoming administration before concluding that deal with China, and maybe signal to China that this is really something that the transatlantic community is behind. Rather than using the chance to do that, some observers say that this agreement actually handed Xi Jinping a diplomatic victory. And yeah, he was able to to conclude this deal, despite the fact that a very Europe-friendly American president was elected into office after the difficult years that Europe had with the Trump administration. Rather than rejoicing in that and supporting the new administration symbolically and diplomatically, the EU chose to hand China that sort of success. And of course, the deal was probably only possible because China wanted to use this window of opportunity of scoring a goal, and so was willing to do some things that it might not have agreed to after the time frame had passed. So this is a complex question, but from my perspective, where I sit, having heard a lot of the critics and having also heard a lot of the people who defend the deal, my personal conclusion is, in the overarching strategic situation that we are finding ourselves in, I find it very regrettable that the EU chose this approach. And I would have much preferred for the EU to just delay it at least a couple of weeks and give the Biden administration a chance to be consulted before any such agreement was concluded. So that's my take. But of course, I'm not a trade expert and I wasn't privy to the consultation. So this is just watching it from an outside observer's perspective.
Yes, I mean, from a diplomatic perspective, it's clear that, these moves that you talked about were just kind of putting salt on the wounds. There's been quite a few diplomatic tensions between the two in the last several years. And one way, the only way to approach China together is to have a stronger relationship between us. So those moves are not in the right direction, but hopefully in the next several years with a new Biden administration, we'll have more in common in certain, democratic human rights issues, climate change, policy towards Iran. Perhaps, China convergence will arrive slowly but surely. But then just lastly, I wanted to ask you, Sarah, there's three main themes to this video podcast series, and they include great power competition, transatlantic relations, and disinformation campaigns. So we've talked extensively about geostrategic competitions and the transatlantic relationship. So would you say that in this era where we're often hearing about fake news or Russian disinformation campaigns, Chinese disinformation campaigns, are we, the West, well prepared to tackle this? Do we have a strategy of our own? Strategic communication is vital, and I don't know if we're using that to our utmost capacity, because it seems that these disinformation campaigns are a very strategic way to, divide and conquer. It really helps in that specific strategy. So, does China utilize this in its divide and conquer strategy towards Europe? And how can we better prepare ourselves to defend ourselves?
Well, China definitely uses information warfare, as it's called in China, to this end, definitely, and has always been doing it. But I think we've been seeing it very clearly during the pandemic. So China has tried to control the narrative surrounding the origin of the pandemic, the causes of the pandemic, and has tried to shape the narrative of the response, picturing China's response as professional and effective, and picturing the responses of other countries, as in particular Western countries, as insufficient. And this is really a nasty campaign that has been going on. Also, the disinformation surrounding the origins of the pandemic, even trying to create a narrative that United States military personnel somehow brought it to China or something. There were actually such theories peddled by diplomats from China. So I think it has partly backfired, interestingly. I think China has overdone it. It has stopped being subtle enough for people not to notice what's going on. So particularly the pandemic messaging was so outrageous that I think it has in part achieved the opposite of what was intended. So many people who were, I think, inclined to overlook previous disinformation campaigns have now woken up to the reality. And there's research being done on that. There are the first monitoring attempts done on these issues and how China is trying to use disinformation to influence public opinion. And I think the first step is always awareness of a problem and knowing the extent of the problem. And then the next step is formulating an effective response. We are seeing, I think, the first attempts to create such responses. So the EU has a tool for countering disinformation and so on. So we have been seeing attempts to counter that. But the most important thing is, of course, for individuals, for normal people to be able to understand when they are being targeted with disinformation. And the free press is, of course, an indispensable mechanism for ensuring that this is the case. And so what I think is happening is that China has a little bit gone overboard with some of its methods and has maybe underestimated the backlash. So I definitely think a lot of what China has been doing since the beginning of the pandemic has been backfiring to an amazing degree, in fact. So many of the things that worked in the past are no longer really working. I've been seeing a lot of press reports recently from individuals who have worked, Western individuals who have worked for not just Chinese, but also Russian propaganda media, and have quit working there and are now telling their stories, what it was like to work in that system. And all of these little pieces are like creating a bigger picture of the extent to which these countries jointly and individually try to poison public discourse to achieve particular aims. So I think what we're seeing is an interesting process right now, waking up to that reality. People like myself, scholars, have long been aware of that, but we were exposed to it in a more subtle form, and it was not always easy for non-scholars to see the problem. Let me just mention a couple of these problems. For instance, when you publish scholarly articles that contain information that China considers harmful, then it's possible that the academic publisher that is going to publish that stuff will be pressured by the Chinese government to not allow the publication or to censor it. So I've actually in the past been asked by a publisher to censor a map where I was showing Taiwan in a different color than mainland China. And the reason given was that this particular publisher had extensive business interests in China and had agreed to making sure that no such material would be published anywhere in the world. We're talking about a publication, of course, that would appear outside China, anywhere in the world. And that was really concerning. And that's already many years ago. And I've been hearing a lot of other such stories from colleagues. And there have also been news reports about such attempts to influence what academics can say and can publish. And this I always found very worrisome. But I've had problems in the past explaining to people why this is a problem. But with this public campaign that we've been seeing surrounding the pandemic, it's become much easier to make people understand that these assaults on freedom of information, on freedom of thinking, on freedom of publishing are really not harmless at all. They go to the core of what liberal democracies stand for, because if our information is poisoned or wrong or biased, nothing works. Our whole political system depends on it. And this is why I think this is one of the most crucial challenges that we need to tackle, stopping the disinformation.
Exactly. It's extremely dangerous, and it can really affect the quality of democracy in a society. And that's really worrisome, as you mentioned, that they're able to have such effects on the publication company, especially a Western one. Or, I mean, that's something we really need to work towards. And the Western people who have worked in those companies coming out to share their stories could serve as a really good counter narrative,
Right.
as a way to make the public, as you said, more aware of what's going on. Because really, if the public doesn't understand, then policymakers, they have nothing. They really need to prioritize the public. So, that's one of our things on our to-do lists for the next few years, to really prioritize. So Sarah, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining us on Security in the 21st Century.
Thank you, Suzanne. It was a pleasure and great honor to be part of your program. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again to our audience for tuning back in. Take care.